Welcome to Parkland's 26th annual Fall Conference. I'm Jason Foster. I am the director of Parkland Institute, and I'm thrilled to be here because this is my first in-person conference as director. I want to start by noting that the University of Alberta, where those of us who are in the room are gathered this weekend, is located on Treaty 6 territory. It's the traditional home and gathering place for a diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Papachase, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. And as we gather this weekend to share wisdom and learn from one another and examine how we can build equitable and resilient communities in the face of growing racism, hate, and violence, it is critical that we do so with an eye to the land and its people, and in the spirit of reconciliation and decolonization. With that, we want to start this evening with land acknowledgement. And so in a moment, I'll be asking Lewis Cardinal to join us to do that. He is a communicator and educator here in Edmonton, and he has dedicated his life's work to creating and maintaining connections and relationships that cross cultural divides. He has a long track record of public service, including board members of many organizations, and he has received the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal for public service, Inspire Award for public service, the Province of Alberta's Centennial Medal for his work in human rights and diversity, the Distinguished Alumni Award from Grant MacEwan University, and he's been conferred an honorary degree of Doctor of Sacred Letters from St. Stephen's College at University of Alberta. So he's got a lot of things that he can put down his arm. He's also a Woodland Cree from the Sucker Cree First Nation in northern Alberta, and he does a number of things. His current project is as a project manager as the Kihai Aski Sacred Land in the city of Edmonton, which is Canada's first urban Indigenous ceremonial grounds, which I think is a remarkable accomplishment. So if I can ask Lewis to join us. And Lewis, I would like to offer you this pack of tobacco in acknowledgement and gratitude for your services tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I want to bring welcome. I also want to bring a reminder of why we do land acknowledgements. When we started that process here in Edmonton many years ago, I wrote that first speech for the then mayor, Mandel, and then with the new mayor, Ron Iveson. And what it was about wasn't just acknowledging the land that we're on, which is vitally important because land is so much a part of who we are as human beings, and it ties us to it. But it also reminds us of that sacredness of the land that we stand upon, that we grow from. It teaches us many things. But also, what we wanted to recognize and acknowledge are the treaties, and the treaties that bind all of Canada together. Canada is a treaty nation from coast to coast to coast. And it brings us together in a relationship that is quite surprising to a lot of people. Because in our traditions, treaties are not just legal devices or contracts in some people's minds. It goes further than that. Treaties is an ancient tradition and an ancient ceremony. It's a ceremony of adoption. It is where one nation adopts another nation. And you become like family, like brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers in a community. And during those times of difficulties, we come together to stand with each other, to share and to learn with each other, much like what's going to be happening over this weekend. But we are like family. Going back to the first treaties, for example, the very first treaty with the settlers was in New York between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. And it was called the Two-Row Wampum. And it taught us some language there about family. Is that the two-row wampum, it's a belt about 4 feet wide and about 6 inches wide. And there's 2 purple stripes on the background of 3 white stripes. And those 2 purple stripes represent the settlers' vessel and the indigenous people's vessel going down the great river of life, sharing the abundance of what life has to offer, never outpacing each other and never getting into each other's vessel to try to steer it either, but to be like family. And that term becomes really important, followed by, for as long as the sun shines, the grass grows and the rivers flow. Those concepts are deeply embedded into what Canada is about. And we have to remember that because it's our ancestors' messages to us that we have to come together as Canadians to live like family. And let's take the name Canada itself, coming from the Algonquian, or Cree word, as I like to say, the Algonquian word kanatan, which means a clean, pure, sacred place. Clean, pure, sacred are interchangeable words. But remove the N from kanatan, and it becomes Kanata, which then became Canada. So Kanata then becomes a verb. It means to make pure, clean, and sacred. In order to achieve Kanatan, we have to practice Canada. And so before we can achieve those goals of cleanliness, purity, and sacredness, we have to ensure that our relationships are in order. First with yourself, then the ones that you love, your family, your extended family, your community, your nation. So I wanted to remind us all of what rests on our feet on this ground is treaty, and it's about relationships. And we are all family. So have a great weekend, and thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Louis. All of you here in person, and I'm told over 100 online, really want to hear Jared Yates Sexton, but you're going to have to put up with me for a few more minutes because there's some things I got to go through. First thing I want to do is I want to thank the sponsors of the conference, because without the sponsors, there is no conference. And so I think it's worthy of noting them. In no order, they're all important to us. It's the Alberta Federation of Labour, the Athabasca University Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Civic Service Union Local 52, Health Sciences Association of Alberta, the Non-Academic Staff Association at the U of A, the United Nurses of Alberta, the University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, which houses the Parkland Institute, and the Woodsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. We also have a couple of media sponsors, which is Alberta Views Magazine, and CJSR Radio here on campus here in Edmonton. Of course, I want to thank the many volunteers that are going to be working very hard over the course of this weekend to make this conference happen. It's important. They're really a key cog in what happens over the course of this weekend, and so Parkland cannot thank you volunteers enough for the work that you are and will do this weekend. I also want to acknowledge that we do have an elected official with us in the room. City Councillor Michael Jans has chosen to join us from the conference. He's over in the corner there. Thank you, Michael. And now I'd like to introduce Timotop Oriola. He's the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies here at the Faculty of Arts, and he's here to bring greetings from the Faculty of Arts, which is the home of the Parkland Institute.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. First, I want to say congratulations to the Parkland Institute and a warm welcome to all the presenters and participants for this entire weekend. I'm delighted to say a few words on behalf of Dr. Robert Wood, the Dean of Arts. The relationship between the Faculty of Arts and the Parkland Institute is long and deep. The Faculty of Arts is proud of the rigorous and robust contributions of the Parkland Institute to public policy in Alberta and across Canada. The Parkland Institute is easily one of the most recognizable entities of its kind in Canada. The theme of this year's conference is Quintessential Parkland Institute. The theme is thoughtful, apt, contemporary, and it is an invitation for a clinical examination of the pulse of society. The theme, Doing Democracy Better, Challenging the Politics of Fear and Resentment, speaks to the need for painstaking socio-scientific engagement with today's multifaceted issues. The January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., the February 2022 Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, the Ambassador Bridge blockade in Windsor, the occupation of the Coutts border crossing here in Alberta all highlight threats to democracy and the rule of law. Democracy is under severe strain on the international stage as well. The rise of political parties and governments promoting fear and resentment is another indication of the challenges. The politics of fear and resentment manifests at both macro and micro sociological or interactional levels. These issues are distilled to the grassroots. Some of those influenced by these discourses are devoting enormous time and personal resources to spread the politics of fear and resentment. One man, as you may know, spent his entire life savings to help the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa with logistics and supplies. As a public intellectual, this is not merely a theoretical issue for me. I receive perhaps slightly more than my fair share of threatening messages. The messages are generally unoriginal and full of the usual diction, colloquialism, slogans, and misleading information typical of the times. For example, go back to your shit old country. And that should sound familiar, I imagine. And this is my favorite. You are not contributing to society, which was entertaining because the message was recorded on my work voicemail. There was an episode in March of this year when a caller systematically recorded a scripted message for me and another U of A colleague. The individual called various numbers at 2 university campuses in our province and recorded the exact message. Some colleagues at the U of A and the U of Calgary were so concerned for the two of us that they informed the police. The U of A Protective Services, the Edmonton Police Service, and the Calgary Police Service all got involved in the matter. Of course, these are relatively benign experiences compared to the more serious outcomes for some of our fellow citizens. But I cite these personal examples to buttress the fact that the politics of fear and resentment is real. We rely on organizations like the Parkland Institute and scholars and activists and concerned members of the public, such as yourselves, to unpack these issues and envision a better atmosphere. I am delighted to see the Parkland Institute continue its long and rich tradition of excellence. The Parkland Institute is masterful at cutting-edge research, publications, and conferences, designed to promote the public good. This year's conference panels include presentations on the rural-urban divide, Alberta politics, gender equality, quality of life, building power in populist times, eco-fascism, and policing, among others. And I should add that I'm on one of the panels tomorrow, so you're welcome to join that. The lineup is strong and highly impressive. I want to congratulate Jason Foster, the director of the Parkland Institute, and all the hardworking staff and volunteers. And thanks to all the presenters and participants. I wish you all a great evening and a wonderful conference. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Timotop. I just want to remind everyone, before we get to our keynote speaker, that Parkland Institute operates exclusively on the donations and support of our members and supporters. We don't receive government funding, much as Danielle Smith may think otherwise. We rely on individuals such as yourself to try and be able to fund the research, the important research that we conduct. And so this is just your regular reminder that support is always appreciated. There's opportunities to be able to pledge some donations at the registration desk, so feel free, if you're so moved by the power of our keynote speaker tonight, to bestow us of a donation. And so just before I introduce Jared Yates Sexton, I just want to sort of recognize, as Timotop did, that the theme for this year's conference couldn't be more pressing. We are in a very difficult and challenging period, not just in Alberta, but in Canada and across the globe. There are movements of anger and resentment that are on the rise. We see the election of far-right candidates in Italy and in sort of Eastern Europe. We saw the very narrow defeat of a Trump-like character in Brazil just weeks ago. And of course, we have the very uncertain times coming in the United States in the next couple of years, which of course Jared will obviously speak about. But we also have here in Alberta our own key moment coming a few months from now. We currently have a premier who has a track record of denying science, a premier who has cozied up to those who wish to elevate their own personal selfishness over that of the public good. And as an institute that cares about the public good, that is something that should concern all of us greatly. is this movement to elevate people's own selfish needs over that of the collective good. So with that, we present to you someone who has thought a lot about this and has written a lot about this, and so I think will offer some very interesting insights for us. Yates Sexton is the author of American Rule: How a Nation Conquered the World But Failed Its People, as well as 7 other books. So there's lots. You could spend many nights reading him as you in your bed, including he has the forthcoming book coming, The Midnight Kingdom: A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. And his work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Progressive, the Daily Beast, Politico, and elsewhere. And he is also the co-host of the Muckrake podcast. We had originally planned to have Jared here with us in person tonight, but an unforeseen health situation made it impossible for him to travel this weekend, and so we have him joining us live via video connection from Indiana. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jared, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate that introduction, and I definitely appreciate what you're doing. I want to start first tonight, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you. It's my heartfelt apology that I cannot be there in the room among you, shaking your hands and beginning the struggle alongside you. But I feel honored and I feel present, if in spirit alone. I want to wish you luck with your work, with your presentations and discussions, because I believe in your mission to better democracy and overcome fear. And I believe this present moment, with all of its trappings and its dangers, but also its possibilities, makes that mission all the more important and pressing. I want to speak tonight about a crisis that we must diagnose and understand, but also come to recognize elements of hope within that threat. Before I begin, I want to accept that speaking of hope and change and a better world might sound foolish considering present circumstances. We are facing many challenges, many of them very large and seemingly immovable. But I want to assure you change is possible and that there is hope should we understand the state of things, realize the true consequences and size of the struggle, and accept the challenge regardless. As to the components and state of play, and considering the breadth and diversity of our audience this evening, please know that some of us are going to be more familiar with these concepts than others, so I pray that you'll forgive any examination of known or seemingly obvious information. Right now, around the world, including the United States and Canada, there is a right-wing, authoritarian, illiberal, white supremacist, patriarchal, anti-democratic movement that is building and co-opting discontent with the status quo. And as that status quo crumbles, that authoritarian movement is gaining in power and in influence. The authoritarian movement feasts on a terrified and lonely public who feel alone and powerless as they recognize that this current system does not represent them or their interests and is forwarding an agenda that makes their lives shorter and worse, that hurts them and hurts the people they love. The authoritarian movement uses racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to take advantage of these feelings and forward their agenda and the agenda of the wealthy backers who seek to further enrich and empower themselves by systematically deconstructing liberal democracy as we know it. Moments like January 6th and the Ottawa truckers incident reveal that these threats are gaining power, purchase, size, and daring. This is because the right wing and the billionaires they represent understand there's opportunity to radicalize the angry and disillusioned using conspiracy theories and angry appeals. But also they recognize that our status quo, the neoliberal consensus, which we will discuss and define in just a moment, has reached a crossroads and must change in some fundamental way. As groups like the Democratic Party fight to maintain the status quo, the right has recognized there is opportunity in offering solutions and alternatives. As the left has been systematically destroyed and dispersed, the right has been left as the sole project offering any solutions and alternatives, regardless of how dangerous and insincere they may be. First, we must discuss and define the neoliberal consensus and how it came to be. To begin, the prior consensus, as many of us know, was the New Deal consensus, which emerged following the economic meltdown of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism and Nazism, and the destruction of the Second World War. This consensus emerged as an answer to the crumbling of capitalism and as an alternative to fascism and Nazism, which were right-wing expressions of capitalism and concentrated wealth attempting to save themselves without losing any wealth or any power. We like to believe in our collective imagination that the New Deal was instantly popular and self-evident, but it was opposed by the wealthy and by corporations, who were more than happy to collaborate with the authoritarian right in attempts to undermine the New Deal agenda, and even more disturbingly, and maybe more familiar, overthrow the government itself. And it bears mentioning the New Deal was only possible because of the efforts of grassroots organizations, populist movements, and struggle by individuals to make it possible. The New Deal addressed the inherent contradictions of capitalism, ensuring that wealth would not be so concentrated as to destroy the system. It established that the government should regulate capitalism while investing in projects focused on helping citizens and providing for security. This consensus dominated the political sphere for decades, here in America finding support in both the Democrat and Republican Party alike, and was considered sacrosanct until the late 1970s, when neoliberalism emerged as an alternative. Before coming to America and the rest of the world, neoliberalism was a product of authoritarian oppression and brutal, murderous discipline. This destructive ideology found wide purchase in response to stagflation and changing economics. Neoliberalism became the new consensus, prioritizing privatization, austerity toward programs and investment, deregulation, and the redistribution in America alone of tens of trillions of dollars from the working and middle classes to the wealthiest few. Even while many of us were left unaware, our system of economics, our society, our politics, our very lives were dominated by this idea and that project, which intentionally sought to make us feel alone and in competition with even our closest friends and family. It depends on keeping us constantly aware of our precarity in order to foster market participation. It intentionally replaced the sense of democratic power in mass politics with a hollow, terrifying consumer society that robs us of identity and purpose and meaning. In short, it has traumatized us as a matter of strategy. If only we had listened, history would have told us what would happen. Neoliberalism led to an overconcentration of wealth, which exacerbated the natural contradictions of capitalism once again, leading to predictable crises and failures, as well as the corruption of government, politics, and culture. At the same time, exploitation of the people worsened, creating frustration, disillusionment, and a desire for something different and better as lives were shortened and made more miserable. This is what the authoritarian right understands, that this need will either be met by a left-wing alternative, a populist alternative that could threaten their power and wealth, or that it could be co-opted and used to further their own ends. Donald Trump, Brexit, the Ottawa truckers' protest, and a whole host of projects funded and organized by the wealthy were based on exploiting this populist frustration and the consequences of neoliberalism. Trump actually ran to the left of the Democratic Party and to the right of the Republican Party, promising to help the conditions and offering a new world in which America was made great again. He did not mean it, and he only forwarded neoliberalism once he was in power. But the makeup of his base is built on addressing very real problems without any intention to actually meet those promises. The growing threat is that authoritarians who are more serious and more competent than Donald Trump, including national conservatives, who understand this and are promoting an aggressive anti-democratic agenda based on disillusionment with neoliberalism. The threat is faux populism that can steal this energy and steal this potential movement. And I hate to tell you this, but it is working. Here's what the authoritarian movement seeks: further dismantling of the liberal democratic state, including democratic and regulatory processes, slashing of wages and programs made possible through violence, martyrdom, discipline, inflicting of suffering on enemies, war through nationalism and venting of internal frictions acquired through the culture war, violence and cruelty as an answer to global climate change, which will only exacerbate conditions and further limit resources and territory. In total, a reactionary, oppressive state built for the white, wealthy, and powerful at the expense of people of color, women, immigrants, indigenous populations, and the poor. But there is hope. These movements show us the way, and they reveal their own weaknesses constantly. Faux populism is an easily disrupted lie, and it only requires actual solutions. But old politics will not solve the matter. We must notice a lack of trust in institutions, including the media, political parties, corporations, and entities like Facebook and Twitter. The distrust is earned, and the distrust is useful. We must look to growing populist and democratic movements, including civil rights and labor struggles, that are operating outside of the status quo for leadership and guidance, including young people forming unions and battling and defeating some of the most powerful corporations and people in the world through organization and solidarity. Democracy, if it is to be saved, depends on the energy of these people and a reframing of what is possible and how it is possible. It is my firm and unbending belief that we already have within us what is necessary to defeat this threat and build a better world. And these movements remind us of that fact. If you would let me, I'd like to tell you a story about my own experience. As of late, as I've grown more and more upset and worried and interested in getting into the fight myself, I've been looking to set up my own operations, possibly a think tank or an institute. And in talking to donors, I have found almost to a person that they distrust the people and they distrust these movements. They think the people are stupid, untrustworthy, unreliable, and undeniably unworthy. They have talked to me about creating shadow structures, including a version of QAnon to combat QAnon itself, a version of Fox News to defeat Fox News, a version of Trumpism to defeat Trumpism. They think that trickery or manipulation is the only means of combating trickery and manipulation. They want to make the problem worse without realizing it, or that their hesitance lies in their own fear. And if you would let me, I would love to speak a hard but necessary truth tonight. I fully appreciate this time and that you are here and that you're hearing me out. I look forward to this discussion and your questions. But this hard truth is nonetheless necessary should we really get to the root of this thing and attempt to find a solution. Think tanks and institutes were born, established, elevated, and operated within neoliberal structures. Even if they are inherently opposed to this neoliberal system, they still are linked to them, chained to ideas born out of neoliberalism, tied to the stringent, unbreaking structures of neoliberalism. Experts who are undoubtedly passionate for change within these groups want desperately to find a way forward to combat the status quo, and sometimes, though they share similar goals, they sometimes look at the people and these movements and they want to organize them, direct them, manage them, act upon them, foster them like a parent because they believe deep down, or rather they fear, that these movements and these people are naive or foolish in their faith that a better world is possible, or even, dare I say, in the near distance. It's time to listen. It's time to bind our efforts. And it's time to rediscover so-called foolish optimism that neoliberalism relentlessly stamps out. These organizers are doing what is supposedly impossible, maintaining their belief in a better future and doing this outside of the structures of neoliberalism that can corrupt them. It is time to listen to them and learn from them. And it's time to provide your help, your expertise, and your energies in the direction that these natural leaders and burgeoning solidarity movements need and choose. This arrangement, built on hope, built on trust, built on faith, and utilizing the solidarity building within these groups outside the structures of neoliberalism is our only hope should we stave off this crisis and this disaster. This is hard. I'm not ignorant of this. Losing control is hard. Opening ourselves up to disappointment, chancing our hopes in our hearts and chancing appearing foolishly naive, that's hard. But we must do it. We must dream and hope and believe in things that have seemed, even most recently, impossible or unrealistic. To individuals watching and listening, to those who are either actively participating in these grassroots movements or who might be moved to join them, engage in solidarity. Always, always engage in solidarity. Politics isn't entertainment. We must quit watching and we must quit waiting. We must quit hoping for saviors and messiahs to suddenly appear on our ballots. We must quit expecting wealthy and institutional politicians to suddenly buck against the system and work to dismantle it. We must learn to trust one another again and heal from the intentional traumas neoliberalism has inflicted. Renew trust with your friends. Renew trust with your neighbors. Renew trust with your families, your communities, and most importantly, yourself. Reject simple and cliched political arguments based on slogans and stereotypes, and embrace the truth that no one can deny any longer. This is a top-down struggle for power that requires change and requires reform. Educate yourself about neoliberalism and these authoritarian components, their histories, but also educate yourself on think tanks like the Parkland Institute, which seek out better ways. It's time to start building bridges and structures between yourself, your communities, and structures like this institute that show a willingness and openness to change and that will work to dismantle this before it's too late and the window to a better world closes shut. Before we discuss these things and many others, I want to return to the subject of foolishness. A fool is a target for derision and distrust. We worry over being a fool and seeming foolish almost as much as we wish for a better world. Neoliberalism and authoritarianism demand the death of hope. They rely on it. These structures and challenges were created intentionally to make us feel alone and make us feel powerless, to leave us feeling in such awe and such terror of the machinery of power that we would never imagine possibly challenging anything, lest we be crushed and our hopes and dreams crushed alongside us. It is much easier and much safer and less dangerous to accept these lies and never possibly appear foolish. But I sit here tonight proud of my foolishness and proud of my unwillingness to let go of my hope. There is a better world possible, and before these systems crushed our hopes and ambitions, before these cruel exploitations traumatized us and limited our ability to dream, I imagine you felt it was possible and possibly even within reach. Tonight, I invite you to be foolish in your work this weekend and in your work beyond. And I invite you to toss conventional thinking and cold, bloodless rationalism aside in favor of a better, realer, more human future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jared. Those are very sort of stirring and poignant words for us and encouragements for moving forward. We have some time to engage in a bit of a discussion, as Jared is encouraging us to try and do.
Thank you, Jared. That was fantastic. You offered to be foolish, so folks that know me know I'll step right into this one fully with you. But what we've witnessed recently in the eastern part of our country, in Ontario, was a rise up and a solidarity fight back against, I would call it neoliberalism. I would call it a full attack on the rights of workers. And it's the first time in a really long time where we saw labor leaders representing millions of workers stand against these actions that were coming under something called the notwithstanding clause that they dropped down to override our rights. The fallout from that is interesting because I don't know if the rest of the country noticed. I'm curious if you noticed. I'm curious if you see unions rising up to try and push back in a solidarity like we haven't seen in a generation. Just any thoughts on that, please? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm glad you brought this up. This is something we should discuss, particularly as we're coming up with solutions and alternatives. No, I had not heard of that. And largely in order to keep up with the burgeoning labor movement in this country, and we're looking in America at historic numbers of not just labor protests, wildcat strikes. We're talking about people engaging in solidarity in just absolute numbers that would have been unfathomable years ago. I want to talk about part of the issue and why that is and why that has occurred. And this is something that isn't very fun. It's not something that is an enjoyable conversation. For years and years and years, we have been told, particularly in America, and I have to assume that you've dealt with similar things, that we have a leftist media, that we have these news corporations, we have these massive gatekeepers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post. We have MSNBC, of course, which represents a corporatist view. We have CNN, which has always represented a corporatist view, but is now even moving further and further right. These things are not treated with respect. They are not treated with any sort of attention. They are starved of any coverage. And the moments that they do come up, they are met with derision. We've seen this in America, and I have to assume you've seen it in social media from time to time. There are these bizarre articles that show up in the New York Times and the Washington Post that are critical of CRT and the left and, woke campuses. And what it actually shows us is something that has been true all along, and it's something observable throughout history, which is that these places represent the focal point of concentrated wealth. It obviously takes a ton of money to run a newspaper, to run a corporate news media operation. And so as a result, people can be as quote unquote liberal as we want to say, but we also know from history that liberalism is about the protection of private property. It's about the protection of people's wealth. That is the basis of originally liberalism and why it's called neoliberalism in the first place. So what I will say is this. We only have to look around to see what is happening. We only have to pay attention to see what is happening. Here in America, yesterday, we had over 200 labor movement actions that took place against Starbucks, one of the biggest corporations in the world, one of the most influential corporations in the United States of America. You had young people who maybe they haven't even been educated in labor history, people who maybe haven't even had the opportunity to go to college. We're watching service workers who don't necessarily have the education that we all think is necessary in order to create these movements. These are people that experience terrible precarity. These are people who are living paycheck to paycheck. And what did they do? They put their lives and they put their livelihoods on the line. What we have to do is not only pay attention to this, we have to get better about that. We have to grow more dogmatic about it, but we need to create situations in which the attention cannot be taken away. One of the largest protest movements in the history of the world, the Black Lives Matters movement that took place, it received incredible media attention in the United States for a couple of weeks, if that, because it made for exhilarating television. There were tons of video and pictures that were coming out of this, of people like showing down with the police. The movement did not end. The protest did not end before the coverage of it left. We were left looking at social media, looking at our cable news channels, looking at our newspapers with nary even a hint of coverage. And that tells us something. That tells us where everything lies, where politics lies, where loyalty lies. And what we're seeing in our media now is that as the Republican Party moves further right, and as neoliberalism enters this crisis stage that will require authoritarianism, we are seeing that our media will go ahead and normalize cruelty. It will normalize conspiracy theories, and it will normalize the discipline necessary to keep these structures moving forward. I think it's becoming clear more and more every day on which side of the line we're on and which side of the line they're on.
You pointed to groups that are organizing around an optimistic view of the future. I've been troubled for some time by certain thoughts that began actually when I watched the television coverage of the truck convoy that went to Ottawa. And when I hear some of the people that they're calling Trump's base talk, I have the awful feeling that some of those people should have belonged in our movement for a better world. I have organized for the NDP most of my life, and I can remember talking to people who looked and talked just like that. But somehow we stopped talking to them, I guess. Somehow they were captured by a different kind of leadership, and they went that way. I just want you to respond to that and tell me if I'm seeing something that might be there or whether I'm filled with false hope, perhaps.
No, you couldn't be more correct. And I'm so glad you asked that question. I have a lot to offer on this topic. I want to go ahead and make it very clear. One of the reasons that I feel the way that I do about politics, the state of the world, and this current struggle is because I grew up the child of factory workers. I grew up in a family of mine workers, prison guards, laborers. And I have to tell you that when I was a child, in the halls and in the rooms of my family, there were commemorative plates. And the commemorative plates featured Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They featured John F. Kennedy. My family understood here in America that the Democratic Party was the party of the people. One of the things that has taken place, and we have to trace this history, is that starting in the 1980s, as neoliberalism was being forwarded as a project with, and by the way, everybody likes to blame Reagan for it. Reagan was the pitch man, right? These were these right-wing, free market, libertarian groups and institutes here in the United States that forwarded this, as well as, individuals like Hayek and the Mont Pelerin Society. What we watched was that the Democratic Party in the 1980s saw the political victories of Ronald Reagan and basically came together and said, we can't defeat this. There's no possibility for the Democratic Party as constituted to in any way, shape, or form to combat this. The only thing that it could offer, Bill Clinton and Al Fromm of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, decided was republicanism with a smiling face. And so what happened at this point, as neoliberalism became the new consensus and took over from the New Deal, so-called liberal movements, so-called left-wing movements, they abandoned their old ideas, the same way that they abandoned the consensus of the New Deal. They stopped looking for labor unions to be part of their base. They stopped looking for people of color. They stopped looking for the poor. They stopped looking for anybody that was interested in reforming or redistributing wealth. And as a result, they turned toward everyone from corporations to the wealthy to non-governmental structures, you name it. And over time, they just jumped fully into neoliberalism, occasionally being the party, the Democratic Party, that would occasionally feel bad about it, that would tell you, I'm really sorry, I feel your pain, I know this is hard. And I have to tell you, people in my family, whether it's free trade or deregulation or privatization, which affected their lives, they correctly identified that the Democratic Party had left them behind. Much like many of the so-called left-wing alternatives move towards this. We've seen this around the world, and it's to the point where even talking about the left is pretending as if we don't need to rebuild the left, as if the left hasn't been completely scattered and dispersed intentionally. In all of this, what you're talking about is absolutely correct, and I think there's an important thing that we can dissect here and that we can talk about. These are people who should be on our side. And I understand that that is often repellent. And I understand it's repellent because some of the things that they say are repellent and disturbing. The conspiracy theories that they peddle, the racism, the nativism, the xenophobia, the casual, gleeful misogyny. And I have to tell you that those things, those were present before Trump. Those were present before this authoritarian movement. I will not make excuses for those. I've seen those all of my life. But I will also tell you that those things have been exacerbated and they have been grown by a political movement that tells them, yes, there is a problem. Yes, there needs to be a solution. Yes, somebody has caused this, and I'll tell you who did it. And they always say it's liberal traders on the inside. It's people of color who are being manipulated because they can't think for themselves. It's, of course, puppet masters who are controlling events, satanic, pedophile cabals, you name it. They have named the problem, and they have used these conspiracy theories. And by the way, history shows us how this works. The powerful constantly admit what they have created and then transfer blame for the problem on their political enemies so that they can avoid repercussions and so that they can further their projects, so they can continue to enrich and empower themselves. This is why when you hear conspiracy theories, and let's just go down the line very quickly and talk about it. We now hear about the deep state. And at the heart of the deep state, which is something Trump and the Republican Party talk about constantly, it's the idea that there is an established, non-democratically elected or accountable group of people who control the government. That's not completely untrue. Neoliberalism relies on technocracy. Neoliberalism relies on so-called experts who should not be held democratically accountable in order to do their jobs. A lot of non-democratic institutions that should control things that shouldn't be left to the whims of the people. When you talk about the deep state, you're talking about an actual problem, but you're changing the problem. When you talk about something like QAnon, you're actually going ahead and you're blaming this fictional supernatural evil for the problems that capitalism has created without ever bringing it up. It's moving those things aside. And so when you hear these people talk, there's undoubtedly, and I always refer to it as the tuning fork of the soul, right? You know when someone is being honest with you. You know when somebody is being square with you. And someone like Donald Trump, it never happens. You know he's lying to you. You know he doesn't mean what he's saying. You know he's manipulating you. When you hear these people talk about a government that's beyond their control, when they talk about secret systems that control their lives and hurt them, they believe it. And what's more, they're not entirely wrong. There are systems of control that are beyond our reach, that going to the ballot box, doesn't fix, which is something we have to disabuse ourselves of. And I want to point out very quickly for the purposes of this conference, making democracy better does not just depend on voting. Voting is one aspect of it. I say constantly that voting is the most minimum level of participation in a democracy that we can have. We have to rediscover civics. We have to rediscover participation. And my God, we have to rediscover solidarity. We have to start having conversations. And we still have to start defining the problem as we're doing here tonight. And unfortunately, the alternative to things like the Republican Party or conservative movements around the world, they're unable to say what the problem is because they are part of the problem. Until they move away from neoliberalism, until they go ahead and talk about the excesses of unregulated capitalism, until they can start talking about the consequences of actions that they themselves have played a role in, there is still so much more opportunity for the people that you're talking about, sir, who are going to be vulnerable to these conspiracy theories because they know deep down in the tuning fork of the soul that something has changed, that they're not being told the truth, and that the systems of power are being kept beyond their control. And as a result, those conspiracy theories find so much room and they find so much purchase. But if we're going to win this thing, and I truly believe we are, we're going to have to start providing actual explanations, actual solutions. And I think some of these people who have been manipulated by not just Trump, but especially the wealthy who make these things possible, who fund these organizations, including January 6th and including the trucker protest, all of it, they fund it, they organize it, they direct it, they use it like a weapon. And until we start offering actual solutions and actual understandings of the problem, those people are going to be vulnerable to those things for a variety of reasons.
I'm Karen Creek. I'm a registered nurse and executive of United Nurses of Alberta. But this goes beyond just unionism. What we've seen a lot of times is education. Our youth aren't being educated in a non-biased way. They don't see both sides of the spectrum. Well, I'll just use me as an example. When I was growing up in the 60s, and I was, learning about all these Catholic priests and ministries that were helping the indigenous population. I had no idea that they were scooping up people to residential schools and, you know, learning after the fact. Like, it's really disgusting that we don't hear about that till later, but we're trying to get truth and reconciliation now. But still in schools, we have a UCP government that has tried to change the curriculum and to take out a lot of those issues. And without knowing our history, you know, how do we go forward and make a better society? You know, because we have to get rid of these neoliberalism. You know, the youth that are coming out to vote now, they should have all the facts. And, you know, to get the youth out to vote, they need to be engaged. And so how do we try and build a good education for our youth?
Well, Karen, first of all, I want to say thank you for the question, but also thank you for your work. And I think to go ahead and talk about education, we first have to address something that you are undoubtedly familiar with, which is that necessary structures that promote health and the betterment of people are starved of resources. I think we saw a lot of that during the pandemic. Unfortunately, we saw a lot of care workers who had to go without necessary life-saving equipment, who were made to work long hours. Those things also take place in education. I am an educator. I recently left academia after watching the horrors of austerity. And by horrors of austerity, I'm not just talking about, oh, you know, they got rid of the coffee maker in the break room. I'm talking about exploitative structures that starve people of necessary resources, that keep people struggling to do their jobs and continually amassing more and more expectations. And that isn't just about making people work harder or making people work longer hours. I'm talking about the type of situations I have seen that has caused unbelievable emotional and physical trauma on people. People who have to go in and do without and feel a lack of support. Those are the natural and absolutely expected consequences of an austerity regime of neoliberalism. In a lot of ways, in education, you have a system that has been systematically starved. In the United States of America, and undoubtedly in Canada, we look at a lot of this as being intentional in nature, right? About having more and more efficiency in our systems. In America, the right wing, the Republican Party, and sometimes the Democratic Party for that matter, has kept resources from schools while continuing to do, things like means testing and or No Child Left Behind, which, basically created structures that legitimized this starving. So we have a lot of teachers who maybe they would like to teach facts, but on top of not having the time to necessarily invest in the research, they also are being encroached upon by increasingly GOP leaders and projects that, again, it's not a coincidence, are being funded by the same wealthy backers who organized and funded January 6th and the truckers, convoy, and all of these things. Those places have been attacked. We are seeing the idea of CRT, which critical race theory, which is not what it is. We're hearing the idea of groomers, that teachers are somehow or another, preying on their students and making them like sexual victims. All of these conspiracy theories and all of these attacks on education are being done because education is absolutely the key to all of this. You'll notice how much time over the past few years, as we're starting to talk about actual history, you'll notice how much time and effort and money is being spent to combat the teaching of history, to combat actual information. And here's the reason why. We've seen this before. I believe you mentioned the 1960s, 1970s. Here in America, we look at the 60s and 70s as this wild time in which the university and the college was let loose and students were engaging in like this, wild revolutionary fervor. And that's true, but it also obscures something else about these structures. It obscures the fact that the colleges and universities, prior to that upheaval and prior to that revolutionary energy, were being used explicitly by the government to go ahead and create weapons programs, intelligence programs, literally creating means to surveil people and to control people. We have to look at these institutions and understand that they were created, again, under liberalism in order to protect property and the wealth of the moneyed class, period. There's a reason why some of the history that we're learning right now, we're only learning it. I didn't know, much like you brought up the treatment of indigenous people in that way, I didn't know the specifics in this country until I was working on American rule. I didn't know the cultural genocide, how we took these things away from people, how we took them away from their families, how we destroyed them as a matter of purpose in the pursuit of power. I didn't know that. I didn't know American history. I thought I knew it. I thought I knew it very well. I paid attention. I read the books. I took the classes. I didn't understand it until I did the education myself. And when I did, I realized that the story of America that I had learned, the conventional history that isn't just in books and universities, it's on our TVs, it's in our movies, it's everywhere, it's omnipresent. I didn't realize that those lies and those mythologies were absolutely necessary for the maintenance of these structures of power. Young people, and this is where I gain a lot of my hope, young people not only distrust these institutions inherently, they're really, really hungry for information and knowledge. And I have to tell you, as much as I sometimes dislike the internet, and as much as sometimes I dislike social media, and listen, we could talk about that all night too, I have to tell you that these systems, though they can be misused and though they can be used to surveil and manipulate people and spread radicalization, these are incredible resources that people are educating themselves with. We have to stop relying on all of these institutions to do it for us. We have to start challenging them. And as we do that, and as we educate ourselves, as we take it under our wings, and I think solidarity is part of that. I think a restless yearning for knowledge and information is part of that. I think as we challenge those institutions, we can begin to shape them. We can begin to use them to make that better future. But we have to do it, and I hate to say this because it's awful, but neoliberalism with its austerity and with its relentless exploitation, we have to do it sometimes on our own time. We have to do it sometimes on our own initiative. We have to educate ourselves in order to prepare ourselves. And I think that we have to consider that personal self-education, finding the truth, finding ideas and philosophy that will forward this. We have to start considering that part of our democratic participation. The same way that solidarity, labor movements, being there for one another, communal aid, antagonizing the system and troubling power. I think that education of ourselves and the spreading of education has to become part and parcel of the democratic project.
Lots of the themes that I've been noticing in the response to your questions, in your speech, trusting each other, in the organizing each other, all these things, and just what you're mentioning just now. What about the other people? The people not in this room, the people not online, the people who probably didn't know about this, didn't care enough to know. And not talking to people, who were at the convoy, the people who were at January 6th, the MAGA base, whatever. The place where majority people lie in the middle, who maybe they do the bare minimum, as you said, voting. But other than that, politics, just a daily part of their lives, not really much to think about. Vote every election, so majority of the time, pretty uninformed. If we're to organize to be back to full populism with, I take it, some real populism, how do we get the population to do that? How do we get them to care about anything when it really, to them, doesn't impact their daily lives until, of course, it's too late?
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic question. And I think it deserves a multifaceted answer. So I hope you'll have patience. On one hand, I want to say something about a disturbing trend that I've noticed recently. Not just in the New York Times, not just in the Washington Post, not just CNN. I have started to notice in conversations with people that we would consider dyed-in-the-wool liberals. In America, and again, I don't know if Canada has this, but during the pandemic, these signs started showing up in people's yards. And they would say things like, in this house, we believe in science, we reject hate, all of these things, like some liberal slogans. With them, Black Lives Matter signs started showing up. Of course, people for a while on their Instagram profiles, Facebook profiles, Twitter profiles, they would post things, in support of, Ukraine or anti-Trump, right? And there's a lot of this that, unfortunately, and I hate to be the person who has to talk about this, but it is true nonetheless. A lot of that is a promotion of an identity, right? It's a promotion of what you think about the world, particularly because sometimes you think it's what the world expects of you. You want to seem, regardless of your social class, regardless of what you do, regardless of where you live, you want to seem like a good, empathic person, as opposed to what Donald Trump represented, right? As opposed to what Vladimir Putin represents. I've noticed a disturbing trend in the past few months in which a lot of the people that we used to refer to as resistors or anti-Trumpers, never Trumpers, a lot of them are starting to express a concern over right-wing conspiracy theories. CRT, for instance, groomers in school, trans and gay people, whether or not wokeness, again, on campuses is a problem. And for the record, all of those are right-wing conspiratorial creations, right? And you're starting to see some of the people that you never would have imagined accepting that. I'm having conversations with never Trumpers who are now talking themselves into supporting someone like Ron DeSantis in Florida, who is a much, much more competent Trump, who is more than willing and capable of using the gears of power to create authoritarian fascistic structures. And he already has. On that same note, I want to point something out about America and our history that we don't like to talk about. There is this fantasy that the civil rights movement of the 60s, that there was just this spontaneous eruption of revolutionary spirit. We suddenly decided that we needed to stop with white supremacy. We suddenly decided that our apartheid state needed to be changed. And, on commercials, on CNN, and movies, this usually happens right as Martin Luther King is hitting the crescendo of his I Have a Dream speech, right? He finished that, and the next thing you know, the apartheid state in America was done, and white supremacy had died, and we're never going to have racism again. These are very, very useful narratives, and you'll notice that even right-wing conservative white supremacists will use them in order to combat power and reform. But the truth is this: the civil rights movement was able to win its victory in large part because it made comfortable liberals, comfortable white liberals in America, uncomfortable. One of the reasons the civil rights movement was able to do what it did was because of the spread of mass media in the form of television. White liberals came home from work, sat over their dinner, and they had to look on the TV as Black Americans were brutalized and destroyed in public, and all of it done on their behalf and in their name. And it suddenly became untenable. The point is this: wealth and privilege and power and comfort very often and most often comes on the backs of people who are being oppressed and exploited. This system, and particularly Donald Trump, I want to point this out. One of the reasons a lot of people hated Donald Trump was because he was embarrassing. He was disturbing. He was unprofessional. He said ridiculous things. He embarrassed the country. And by the way, for the purposes of this conversation, I'll point out, he reflected back to us what we were afraid that we were. This vain, self-dealing, insecure ugliness that we all sort of harbor and we have to defeat. Now that we're moving to something more competent, many people will return to their comfort that they were in before 2016. And I always say this: Donald Trump was not the disease. He was a symptom of something larger. He was a symptom of a disease that was hidden, particularly from many comfortable white people. We can never afford to go back to normal. Normal was awful. Normal was oppressive. This system that we're discussing tonight, neoliberal structures of oppression that are getting worse, they are not going to get better. There is no solution right now to the neoliberal capitalist crisis that doesn't involve either major change or involves an authoritarian move to install discipline while wages and standards of living go down. Those are the only two options. There's nothing else. And history shows us, unfortunately, and I appreciate your question for this reason, It shows us that fascism, Nazism, authoritarianism, it is accepted by the middle class, the white middle class, that doesn't like what they do, doesn't like their brutishness and their violence, but they also don't want to lose their power. They also don't want to lose their wealth. They don't want to chance it on reform or change. So I have no other way to say this. We have to have conversations with these people. We have to make sure that they understand that other people feel concern, that other people see the threat, they see the writing on the wall. We have to present them again with what we were just talking about, real history. We need to understand that authoritarianism doesn't happen because a Hitler is good at speeches, but because capitalism makes it happen and finds its way into these structures. We need to make sure that our reality is expressed to them and that they're not comfortable in a reality that serves their power and influence and comfort. And on top of that, in the midst of all of it, and this goes back to the original question of not hearing about these protests, not hearing about these labor struggles, we're going to have to make some people uncomfortable. We're going to have to make them realize that their comfort and their privilege relies on the broken bones of people, that their comfort and privilege relies on exploitation. And by the way, it's not just in America or in Canada. Neoliberalism went ahead and took the exploitation, the crushing labor, the slave labor, and moved it outside of our borders so we didn't have to look at it. The first world, the so-called first world, has benefited from this for decades. I mean, and actually, if you want to take it back further, centuries, but this current iteration relies on exploitation. And it's time we start thinking about what we buy. It's time that we start thinking about what the foundation for our lives are. And a lot of us, and I count myself in this, I include myself in this population, we're going to have to be forced to look in the mirror. We're going to have to be forced to look in the mirror and understand what it is we've relied on and what it is that has benefited us and made us comfortable. But you're exactly right. This is absolutely essential, and this is going to be a component of making anything better.
Thank you. I'm going to take the prerogative of being the guy at the podium to ask a question myself. I'm intrigued, Jared, by your call to have us embrace being foolish. And I wonder, though, if there's a bit of a tension in there, in that the authoritarian right, one of their key tactics is to undermine the legitimacy of expertise and of experts and of science and the like. But then one of the things we need to do if we're going to effectively be foolish in order to make change is that we need to be able to skeptically challenge the narratives and the stories that we have been told by neoliberals for decades under the guise of expertise, economists and politicians and the like telling us what we cannot do because the economy won't allow it. So I'm wondering, how do we engage in that healthy skepticism of the messages we get from neoliberals without falling into the trap that the authoritarian conservatives want us to fall into of challenging all expertise?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that. I could talk about this for a few hours, so I'm going to condense this down, and hopefully sometime we can figure out a time to get into this. I've noticed a really interesting thing. I was having a conversation about this yesterday, actually. And, as somebody who self-flagellates and reads the New York Times opinion page often, one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of their so-called experts, a lot of their economists, a Thomas Friedman, a David Brooks, right? These people who they've earned millions of dollars having all of the answers. Over the past year or so, and I hope maybe some people in the audience have seen this as well, they publish one column after another in the newspaper of record saying, I don't know what's going on. Who can even tell what's going on? And one of the amazing things about neoliberalism, and this is something that we need to remember, neoliberalism doesn't actually make sense. Neoliberalism, the way that it is constructed and the way that it works, is less of an economic theory, and it's actually more of a religious faith. Because what we keep seeing in all of these instances is this idea that the free market somehow or another creates the best of all worlds, Well, I'll tell you what, I haven't looked, and maybe since I started this speech, Twitter has absolutely flatlined. But I will tell you that we are getting a real-time example of the fact that wealth and power and influence do not denote competence. Donald Trump did us an incredible favor. And Donald Trump gave us, and listen, I know we all went through it, but we got a 6-year lesson that many of us knew, but some of us had to learn, that just because somebody has billions of dollars or hundreds of millions, depending upon what day it was, just because they have that doesn't mean that they're wealthy or that they're talented. It means that these systems were tailored to them. There is, by the way, and this is something we could discuss later, there are inherent flaws in the idea of liberalism. The idea that the wealthy and the powerful and the market should decide these things, right? And that the wealthiest people should run the world. And on top of that, the way that we trouble these economists, the way that we trouble these prophets of free market capitalism, these prophets of neoliberalism, is that they are constantly ignoring history. History is very clear about what happens when you refuse to regulate capitalism. And in fact, if they want to get in an argument, we can talk about the fact that Adam Smith, of all people, in 1776, in the defining document of capitalism, Wealth of Nations, said that capitalism needs to be controlled and regulated, lest the wealthy create a conspiracy against the people. That was Adam Smith, the person that, they basically have like in a frame above their beds at night. Like the way that we talk to them is we point out that every time this happens, and you look at someone like an Alan Greenspan, when capitalism melted down in 2008, he said, I don't know what happened. I guess my faith was misplaced. 2 years later, he gave a speech and he said, I guess there's nothing we can really do. The best we can hope is to avoid the worst pitfalls. We have seen it. It is marked and it is obvious what is happening here. And while we're being foolish, and I think foolishness has to do with a couple of things. I think it has to do with maintaining hope, maintaining faith in a better future, but also foolishness in being willing to do these things and being willing to go outside of our bounds. And I have to tell you, as a recovering academic, I come from a working class family, and I have to tell you, I never felt comfortable in academia. And I never felt comfortable in large part because academics and experts often silo themselves away from the rest of the world. We talk to one another, right? Going back to the previous question that was asked. We have conversations that are based on our expertise. We use jargon that keeps them out. And on top of that, we give them prescriptive ideas that are based in our education and our siloed experiences. If we listen, if we talk, we can find common ground. And I want to say this, maybe if anything follows you from this talk and this Q&A, I hope to God that this thing does. Just because the people are on the other side of the line, as the one questioner asked, just because they're believing just absolutely incoherent conspiracy theories, just because they voted for Donald Trump, just because they are not experts, and just because they are not in this room with us tonight, it does not mean that they are stupid. Some of them are ignorant. Some of them have not been afforded an education. I had to take on tens of thousands of dollars of insurmountable student debt to leave my family and go and get that education and be able to talk to you tonight and have these conversations. Not everybody can afford that. Not everybody is willing to take that risk. And I have to tell you, the divide between people who can afford education and the people who can afford to take on the debt of education and the people who are given the support and the structures that support them in education, there's a divide between them and the people who have been left behind by the neoliberalization of the university and education. We have to go out, we have to talk to them, we have to share information, we have to be able to code switch, we have to be able to engage in solidarity across class lines, and we have to be able to learn from each other and trust one another. And I have to tell you, again, as a recovering academic, what I'm telling you by many of my former colleagues would have been considered foolish. And it's time that we start taking these chances, and it's time that we start building the movement that can get this thing done.
Very quick question. Could you name 3 to 5 podcasts, news sites? Like, if we're not going to read the New York Times anymore, where do you get your news? How do we keep connected? How do we tell these stories? Just a quick handful of things that we can take home and inflict upon our loved ones.
Well, I appreciate that question. I think first and foremost, the Muckrake podcast with Jared Yates Sexton, I can't even begin to tell you, it's a must. I think a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about like what media we consume, and again, this goes back to the idea of siloed. For me, the change happened, when I discovered bell hooks. The change happened when I discovered Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky. Recently, one of the people that I appreciate the most is this documentarian from England named Adam Curtis, who makes these incredibly beautiful, but also sort of haunting and puzzling documentaries about a lot of politics and history. I can't recommend him enough. I think one of the things that we should do, and one of the things that I've done, is when I found myself trying to learn what was going on, first and foremost, I started moving beyond the bounds of my comfort level. I, of course, as a good recovering liberal, as a former Democrat who has renounced his part in the party, again, reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, I was like, these are the pieces of record. I was watching MSNBC all the time. That's it was that sort of an existence. When I decided that they were not up to snuff in terms of giving me a three-dimensional view, an accurate view of what was going on, I moved beyond my boundaries. I would read Jacobin. I would look and see what socialists and leftists were saying. But I also started looking to the far right. I spend a considerable amount of my time in research, reading the far right, examining, analyzing, researching the far right. And by the way, you need to do this, because while the liberal media and mainstream media doesn't pay attention to these people, they have grown bold. They will simply tell you what they believe and what they think in so many words, their speeches, their articles, their books, their podcasts. The Claremont Institute is something that everybody in North America and the world should be listening to, because these are intellectuals who are taking Trumpism, reverse engineering it, and turning it into usable, effective authoritarianism. They advocate Caesarism. They advocate illiberalism. They want to recreate what is happening in Hungary and in Russia. As we're expanding our view, I want to go ahead and invite you to something else, which is it's really important to read things like the New York Times or the Washington Post, or watch things like CNN or MSNBC, but with a critical eye, and start to understand how the viewpoint and perspective of capitalism, particularly liberal capitalism, old school liberalism, those types of things, free marketism, whatever you want to call it, how those things are being expressed, how they cover things, how they talk about things, what they don't talk about, what they do talk about, how the story is framed. What are they willing to say? And what do they keep from saying? What are they afraid of? And once you start to recognize that and you start reading these things more closely, also The Atlantic is another one that occasionally has very brilliant pieces, but also you can study and understand what the perspective of the wealth class and liberalism and neoliberalism, what they are and what they're saying and what they're not saying. So it's about expanding the reach beyond our comfort zone, but also re-examining what our comfort zone was and what it represents.
My name's Ken. I'm a registered nurse, and I'm also representative with UNA. So one of the things that I'm going to just take back from this today is something you have talked about, asking a question that we're uncomfortable with and asking people to ask questions they're uncomfortable with. And I think there's one very similar one that comes to my mind is, what is more important to the people? And I'm going to speak from an Alberta perspective. What is more important, healthcare, education, or low corporate tax rates? And of course, we know corporations love the low corporate tax rates. But I think the question is, so do people. Because the first thing they're going to hear is, well, if I don't have a low corporate tax rate, you're not going to get the bonus this year. You're not going to get the increased salary. So those are things that it's an uncomfortable question for any member of the public to ask, because they've been taught this is what you need to do because this is economics. And as you mentioned earlier, some economics theory, the first thing I always read in economics theories is the reason we have inflation is salaries. And if you keep salaries down, inflation will take care of itself. Again, pretty well constructed by corporations for that particular interest. So trying to figure out what we can do as an organization. We typically have a lot of education for our membership. our membership education seems to always be tended towards the collective agreement. How do we interpret it? How do we use it? How do we run our unions? I think what I'm getting from you today and what I'm hearing is going back to our board and asking the question is, should we be focusing more of our education so that our members can feel comfortable talking to other people on different spectrums, so that they're asking different political questions, not in a favoritism of one political party, but looking at what they're representing and what they're going to bring. Stop trademarking political parties. Stop being grandpappy voting for Pappy just because they did, and I'm going to vote that same party in too. I'm not a political proponent of any party. It's got to be the people running the party that I'll be interested in. We have to maybe look at educating in that manner first to get our membership to move forwards just out of our little silo of a collective agreement, but into a bigger political silo. And when you mention education being attacked, healthcare, we've taken hits, of course, not nearly to what education has hit, because in our field, healthcare, if there's a bad outcome, it could be the death of a person. That's pretty obvious in the media, that's going to hit. The lack of education towards students, you don't see that outcome. So then, unfortunately, when I hear about teachers having to bring supplies into school, having to do this, that's totally inappropriate. But again, what is our priority? Is it education, healthcare, or maintaining low corporate tax rates? Not only corporations, but we got to challenge each and every individual out there. Why are you supporting low corporate tax rates? Is it for your personal interest? Then you also can't be speaking negatively towards education and healthcare. So that's something I'll bring back to the board that I'm meeting in a few weeks to talk about.
I gain a lot of confidence in hearing that because I think that is absolutely essential. And I want to add something to that. Based on your question and the way that you framed it, I think that you and I could have a conversation about how you should tax corporations. I think we could have conversations about policy. I have to tell you something, and going back to what I was saying about my people, my family, the people, the community that I'm from, they unfortunately, again, have not had the education that we have. They haven't had the exposure to these particulars, the jargon, the background, all of the structures that make it possible for us to understand this, right? And I have to tell you something that you touched on, and I want to go a little bit deeper into. We have to have, and this is something that the right wing understands. This is something that the right wing absolutely has run laps around in America, the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party wants to talk about means testing. They want to talk about, oh, this program here, and you sign up for this, and this will lead to that, and that is that. And by the way, my family would benefit from some of these programs. But if you think that my family can navigate the bureaucracy that the Democratic Party creates and advocates, you are wrong. They don't understand it. And on top of that, they get frustrated and they get pissed off and they don't want to deal with it. What the right wing has figured out, and what the right wing has always known from the beginning of conservatism, which, by the way, was based in conspiracy theories, and it was based in paranoia and fear-mongering. What they understand is that the initial way into a conversation that will lead to change is emotion. We can't just talk about corporate tax rates. We can't just talk about this program will put this amount of money in this school, or it will go ahead and fund this way. We have to start by pointing out that this is a class struggle. And this goes back to the remarks that I made tonight. We have to point something out, which is you deserve better. You live in a world right now that is specifically tailored to the wealthy and the powerful at your expense. You shouldn't feel the way you feel at work. You should have better health. You should be able to enjoy your life without backbreaking labor. You should enjoy your life without these systems of control that make you miserable and make you sick. And what's more, your children deserve better. Your families deserve better. Your communities deserve better. Look around at the wreckage that these people have caused. And by the way, get pissed off about it. Get angry about it, because you deserve to be angry about it, because you have been fed a lie and you have been traumatized and you've been put through the ringer by people who don't care about you, and people that not only destroy your life, but they profit from the destruction of your life. And once we get through the emotional part of this, and that's something that we need to learn from. And by the way, as you're talking about the specifics of policy, as you're talking about all of the studies and all of the research that you have done, and it's essential stuff, take moments to think about how do we get to an even playing field where we can have that conversation with the people that we need to win over. And we do that emotionally, and we do that by setting together the idea of solidarity. I'm in this with you, and I'm in it to help you and your children and your family and your community. And once we get past that, we can get past the instant things. Because I have to tell you, you talk about taxes with my family, they don't want to pay taxes. Why would they want to pay taxes? They're paying taxes to a government that will not help them and isn't interested in them. As a result, the right wing comes in and emotionally takes this thing off them. Real fast, and I know that we're at the end here. I just want to say very quickly, again, thank you for all of this. I've been looking so intently and so passionately at the work of the Parkland Institute and the people who are presenting and having these conversations. I'm sorry I'm not there. I hope you'll reach out to me and we can have a conversation, because I'm really looking forward to that. But also I want to say that I believe in you and I believe in what you're doing. And this is not a bloodless conversation. This is not a conversation that is about moving decimals here or there or means testing or whatever. The difference is whether or not we make this world better or whether or not we stand by and watch it become worse. And I have faith in you that you will have conversations that will lead to a better world this weekend. And I just wish you luck and Godspeed.
On behalf of Parkland Institute, Jared, I want to offer our sincerest thank yous for your thoughts this night. They were both insightful, hopeful, and give us, hopefully, the motivation to not just have discussions this weekend, but to go out back into the world and act in order to try and make that better world. So once again, thank you so much. We're sorry you couldn't be here in person with us, as I think we would all have appreciated your physical presence here, but we are certainly better off for having at least had your virtual presence. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for this evening. We'll be starting tomorrow morning with Sam Moore, who will be talking about the environment, fascism, and democracy as we continue this conversation. So thank you for this evening. Have a safe drive home or walk home, and we'll see you all in the morning.